becoming Queen Elizabeth II. Whoosh! Bang! The fireworks exploded in London's skies. Down below, thousands of excited people pressed into Piccadilly Circus. Someone shouted, "God save the Queen!" 27-year-old Princess Elizabeth had been crowned Queen that morning. It was Tuesday, the 2nd of June, 1953. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, spoke into a large BBC microphone.
"We have had a day which the oldest of us are proud to have lived to see, and which the youngest will remember all their lives."
The street parties continued all night. Elizabeth was born on 21st April 1926. She was King George V's granddaughter. She called him Grandpa England. The serious little girl and her younger sister Margaret lived a quiet family life, walking dogs and riding ponies. Then, in 1936, old King George V died and everything changed for young Elizabeth. King Edward VIII, Elizabeth's uncle, took over the throne, but there was a problem. He wanted to marry Mrs. Simpson, who had already been married. This was not allowed, so Edward abdicated. Instead, Elizabeth's father became King George VI, and her mother became Queen Elizabeth. King George VI was a quiet man who stuttered when he spoke. Being king was a terrible strain, and just 3 years later, the strain became far greater. Britain was at war. German troops had invaded countries in Europe. Now, in 1940, German warplanes blitzed and bombed their way across London, killing thousands. Londoners scurried to the underground. There were very few proper shelters. Above, in the East End, whole streets were turned to rubble and fire. Bodies lay in their flattened homes. Then the Germans began to bomb other British cities. Thousands of city children were evacuated, sent to live out of harm's way in the country. The princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were sent away from their London home, Buckingham Palace, too. Some nights they slept in the dungeons under Windsor Castle. Britain had to fight back. A few hundred brave pilots fought the Germans in the skies above England. Many of them died, but they shot down even more enemy planes. The Battle of Britain saved the country from invasion. Still, the German bombing continued. The King and Queen shared their people's sorrow. When a bomb fell on Buckingham Palace, the Queen wrote, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now it makes me feel we can look the East End in the face." On her 18th birthday, Princess Elizabeth joined the ATS, Auxiliary Territorial Service, as a trainee driver and mechanic. For the first time, the young princess mixed freely with people her own age. She had been educated at home, not in school, with other children. At last, on the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Everyone celebrated. "For he's a jolly good fellow," the happy crowd sang to the king outside Buckingham Palace. King George and his family stood waving from the balcony. That night, the two princesses sneaked into London's crowded streets with only a policeman and two soldiers to guard them. "I pulled my uniform cap well down over my eyes," Elizabeth remembered. But the street parties were soon over. After 6 years of war, the British were tired. Hundreds of thousands had been killed. Cities were bombed out, and the country was in debt.
"We have a great deal of work to do to win the peace as we won the war,"
said the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. The royal family had its own work to do, but the king seemed old before his time. Years of worry had made him tired and ill. Elizabeth was young, nearly 20, but as heir to the throne, she was expected to marry. Not to do so was unthinkable, said her old governess. So the princess made her choice. Prince Philip of Greece. He was a distant cousin whom she had known as a child. He was in the Royal Navy. In 1947, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, now the Duke of Edinburgh, were married in Westminster Abbey. It was a happy moment in a terrible year. The winter of 1947 had been the worst in living memory. There was a shortage of bread and coal, so people were hungry and cold. On top of it all, the government had to raise people's taxes to help pay the country's debts. The king looked at the world about him. "I do wish one could see a glimmer of a bright spot in world affairs," he said. "Never in the history of mankind have things looked gloomier than they do now." Over the next few years, the king's health became worse. Princess Elizabeth, meanwhile, had given birth to 2 children, Charles, born in 1948, and Anne, in 1950. Busy with her young family, she now also began to take over her father's royal duties. In 1951, Elizabeth took the salute at the Horse Guards Parade. She looked a tiny figure as she rode to Whitehall. In September, the king was found to have cancer, and surgeons removed a lung. The country was suffering too. Rationing and long queues for food continued. Everything was in short supply. But some things lightened the gloom. People were cheered by Elizabeth, their fairy tale princess. She and her young children gave the country hope. In fact, things were slowly improving. The 1951 Festival of Britain had been another ray of light in dark times. 8 million people visited the festival on the south bank of the River Thames. It showed how exciting the future might be. Now the shops began to fill with bright new things for the home. There was vinyl furniture, radiograms, washing machines, cookers and fridges. Most exciting of all was the television set. The government was building new homes and new towns. In 1948, they had set up a National Health Service, which gave free healthcare to everyone. In the new year of 1952, Elizabeth and Philip set out on a state tour to Australia, visiting Africa on the way. King George was too weak to go. He was thin and pale as he waved goodbye to his daughter and son-in-law at London Airport. After a few days, the royal couple arrived in Kenya. They went on safari, staying at Treetops, a house nestling in the high branches of a huge old tree. They had wonderful views of the wild animals below. Back at his royal home in Sandringham in Norfolk, King George had enjoyed a good day's shooting, but went to bed early feeling tired. That night the king died quietly in his sleep. At dawn that day, Elizabeth and her companions had watched a huge fish-eagle soar above treetops. She didn't realize it at the time, but she was now Queen of Great Britain. It took several hours for the news of the king's death to reach the royal couple. Prince Philip broke the tragic news to his wife. The new queen prepared to return to England immediately. In London, the government's cabinet met to fix a date for the coronation. Winston Churchill was once again Prime Minister, but he was a very old man. He wanted the Queen crowned before he retired. The date was set for the 2nd of June 1953. At once there was great excitement in the air. Life was getting better. The country was richer and rationing was nearly at an end. "This is a new Elizabethan age," people said. "In Elizabeth I's day, England was young and exciting. Now Queen Elizabeth II will rule a new, modern country too." People prepared for the coronation day, the greatest celebration since the end of the war. They decorated their houses and shops in red, white and blue. Town councils organized street parties. Queen Elizabeth's coronation would be unique. TV cameras were set up at Buckingham Palace and inside Westminster Abbey, where the coronation would take place. For the first time, everyone could see their monarch crowned, and millions around the world could watch too. When June arrived, crowds of people flocked to London. Thousands camped out in the Mall. In the wind and rain, they lined the route all the way from the palace to Westminster Abbey. 25 million viewers sat down to watch television. In the streets, parties began. Just before the Queen left Buckingham Palace, news spread through the waiting crowd. People clutched at newspapers.
On 29th May at 11:30 a.m., New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay from Nepal reached the 29,028 feet summit of Mount Everest.
They read, "It was a proud day. British and Commonwealth teamwork had made it possible for two men to stand on the roof of the world. It was the perfect news to hear on the day the Queen was crowned." The Queen left Buckingham Palace for her coronation in a beautiful gold coach. At the Abbey, the Queen sat in St. Edward's golden throne, and the ceremony began.
Sirs, I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen,
declared the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Queen took her oath in a clear, high voice. She promised to rule with justice and mercy, and to protect the Church of England. "I promise to serve the peoples of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Commonwealth." The Archbishop anointed the kneeling Queen with oil. It was time for the crowning. The Queen sat with symbols of state, an orb, a sceptre, the rod of mercy, and a sapphire and ruby ring. Then the Archbishop placed St. Edward's crown onto the Queen's head.
"God save the Queen!"
the lords cried.
"God save the Queen!"
echoed the congregation. The Archbishop blessed the Queen and paid homage, kissing her right hand. Then Prince Philip paid homage too. He kissed the Queen's left cheek. The crowd was wild with excitement when they saw the newly crowned Queen walk out of the Abbey. A cold wind lashed at the coach as it slowly returned to the palace. 29 bands played, and 13,000 soldiers marched on the 11-kilometer route. The crowds stayed outside the palace until nightfall. The palace balcony was decorated in scarlet and gold. Just as the light faded, the Queen stepped out again into its floodlit glare. "Hurrah!" the crowd cheered. They tossed streamers and hats into the air and waved their flags. The Queen turned on a switch, and a river of light flashed down the Mall. Soon Nelson's Column, the West End, and City were bathed in light too. 30,000 joyful Britons surged into Piccadilly Circus and danced and sang until dawn. All around Britain, people were happy. They had a new young Queen. They thought life would get better and better. It was the dawn of a new day and a new Elizabethan age. Thank you for listening.